So my op-ed today over at HartmannReport.com is titled Oligarchy, When Brutal Capitalism Becomes More Important Than Democracy. And there's a point to that. It goes back to an interview that I had on this program with Stephen Moore. And this was years ago. This was back like 2008, 2010, something like that. It was long before he was working for Donald Trump. And, I asked him just straight up. In fact, there's a link to the actual interview. It's on YouTube. In the article at HartmannReport.com, I asked Stephen Moore, I said, which is more important, capitalism or democracy? And he, without missing a beat, he said, capitalism. His rationale was that without capitalism, you can't have democracy, which is, kind of sketchy. But without debating that, the point that I'm making in this op-ed and that I want to make right now is that we are now in a full-blown oligarchy in the United States. And that's a dangerous thing because oligarchies almost never last more than a single generation. Oligarchy is rule of, by, and for the rich. For example, yesterday the New York Times was reporting, or actually it was the Washington Post was the one that I read, that the Sackler family, this multi-billionaire family, are reaching a settlement with the individual states that are suing them for killing 500,000 Americans with their marketing practices around OxyContin. The Sackler family is going to get to keep somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 billion, and they're going to give the states $4 billion over a 9-year period, which means that they probably will pay most of it with the interest they're making on the money that they have invested. But whatever. This is the new settlement. But back in 2007, they had worked out a settlement where they said, okay, we won't push these drugs anymore. Sorry, we didn't mean to kill all those people. And then, as the Washington Post notes, after that 2007 settlement, quote, the family members, including Richard Sackler, David Sackler, Mortimer D.A. Sackler, Kathy Sackler, and Jonathan Sackler, who is now deceased, demanded in 2012 the company executives come up with a plan to generate greater revenue in response to slumping sales, according to the Justice Department settlement. These guys are recidivists. They're repeat criminals, right? Career criminals. And they're billionaires, so what's going to happen? Well, they're going to have to take some of the dividends and interest that they're making off their $10 billion bucks and pay it back to some of the states to kind of undo some of the damage for all those dead people and all those lives that have been shattered and all those families that have been destroyed. But they're not going to have to give up any of their mansions or their chalets or they're not going to have to stop flying in their private jets. Meanwhile, Jessica Resnick, yesterday, or maybe it was the day before, was just sentenced to 8 years in prison. 8 years, hard time. She's 39 years old. Her crime? She damaged a pipeline, an oil pipeline that was in construction. She, at her sentencing, she said, quote, the toxins we enter into our waterways here in Iowa enter into the Mississippi, which enters into the Gulf of Mexico. Going to this extreme was out of character for me. She was trying to save her community. She was trying to save the world. She's going to prison for 8 years because she's not a billionaire. I mean, it just really comes right down to that. And on the same day that she was sentenced, an Exxon Mobil lobbyist and senior executive came out and said, we're going to block a carbon tax, even though we say we're in favor of it. We're not going to allow any kind of substantive legislation to pass that is going to move America off a fossil fuel-based economy. And by the way, I've got a dozen senators in my back pocket, including Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. We own them here at Exxon Mobil. Now, it's not a verbatim quote, but it's, you can look it up. And so, he says this the same day that Jessica gets, sentenced to 8 years in prison. And nobody from Exxon is going to jail. Nobody's even paying a fine for like the heat dome that hit us here for 3 days with 116-degree weather that killed over 116 people in Oregon, killed a couple hundred people in Washington State, killed over 500 people in British Columbia, fried over 1 billion sea animals just on the Canadian coast. Exxon's not only is nobody going to jail, nobody's even paying a fine. And the fossil fuel money, it just keeps rolling into Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. And if you and I try to mobilize to do something about it, to stop them at the polls, to stop Exxon Mobil's efforts or their bought-off politicians, yeah, the Republican elected officials said, yeah, we can just purge people from the voting rolls that we don't like. We can make sure that they face a 10-hour line to vote. This is what the Supreme Court said last week. It's okay if Texas writes a law. Texas is criminalizing voting. They're creating over a dozen new felonies, all associated with voting. You help somebody fill out their ballot, you could go to prison. You bring them an absentee ballot, you could go to prison. You fill out your ballot wrong. You put in your full middle name instead of your initial, or vice versa. You know, it doesn't match what your voter registration says. You can go to prison. They're proposing a dozen new felonies and it's very simple. I mean, you know, they sent a black woman who voted after getting out of jail, not realizing that you can't do that in Texas. If you've ever gone to jail, you lose your vote. She voted. Her vote never got counted. It got caught. But they sentenced her to 5 years in prison for voter fraud, you know. I mean, what we're watching right now is the final stage of this 40-year program that Ronald Reagan kicked off to turn America from a forward-looking and still evolving democratic republic into a white supremacist ethno-state ruled by a small group of neo-fascist oligarchs. That's where we're at. And as I said earlier, the problem with oligarchy is that they are unstable. They flip in one of, and the reason they're unstable is because an oligarchy, virtually by definition, is the oligarchs, the very, very wealthy, extracting wealth and power, political power, from the people. And the people at some point say, enough! And then the oligarchy, the institutional, the institution of these oligarchs does one of two things. Either it says, okay, we give up, which is what happened in 1865 after a 5-year war, the Civil War, where the oligarchs in the South tried to overthrow our government. Or they say, we give up like they did in 1933 after Franklin Roosevelt busted their plan to kidnap and probably murder him when General Smedley Butler spoke up. Or if they don't lose or give up, or they double down and they turn the country into a police state, which is what happened in Russia. It's what happened in Turkey. It's what happened in Hungary. And those are just, the European countries. Oligarchic governments always set up, once they get close to oligarchy, they set up the oligarchy and then prepare the way for this fascist state by, number one, changing laws and regulations so their buddies can own or control most of the media. See 1987, Reagan does away with the Fairness Doctrine. 1996, Bill Clinton signs the Telecommunications Act, which does away with local ownership rules. Number two, they stack the courts and regulatory agencies with oligarch-friendly ideologues or outright corrupt toadies. Look at what has happened, in particular during the George W. Bush administration and the Clean Skies Initiative, the Healthy Waters, and of course, Donald Trump's administration. Number three, they cut taxes on the rich and drive down wages on working people, while criminalizing or cracking down on dissent, particularly any kind of dissent that involves property damage. This is what happened to this young woman who was just sent to prison for 8 years. Number four, they distract voters from their own looting by demonizing minorities and encouraging racism. Is this starting to sound familiar? Number six, they actively suppress the vote among people inclined to oppose them, typically minorities and the young, or outright rig the vote to ensure their own victory. And finally, they transform their nation into a police state by heavily criminalizing demonstrations. You will recall over a dozen states now passed laws saying, either criminalizing protest in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests or allowing vigilantes to drive cars into them and kill people without penalty. They criminalized demonstrations, they criminalized nonviolent resistance, and of course they criminalized direct action, property damage, while they radicalize and encourage their vigilante militias. I mean, we saw this in Italy in the 20s, we saw it in Germany in the 30s, we saw it in Russia in the 90s, we saw it in Hungary in the 2010s. We're seeing it happen right now in the United States. Now, how do you stop that? You pass laws to basically outlaw a lot of this kind of behavior and break up the monopoly. I was very gratified yesterday to see that Joe Biden issued an executive order directing all the federal agencies to start looking at these monopolies. That's the step one to taking apart an oligarchy. Number two, you've got the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, H.R. 4, and you've got the For the People Act, H.R. 1, which will make it much, much harder for these Republican-controlled states to make it harder for people to vote. And in order to get there, what do we have to do? We have to end the filibuster. And I don't care if Exxon Mobil does say that he's, the lobbyist and senior executive does say that he's got Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin in his back pocket, along with a few others. We still need to lean on these people. We need to blow up the filibuster. We need to end the filibuster and start getting something done in this country for the people. You had a Republican member of the House of Representatives just 2 days ago come out and say, our strategy from now until the 2022 elections is to block anything that the Democrats want to do, to create complete paralysis, I'm paraphrasing, to create complete paralysis and, just totally demoralize the Democratic base so they don't show up to vote. We can't let them do that.